Hello and welcome to Breaking Culture Live. I'm your host, Sean Johnson Andrews, and I'm broadcasting from Chicago. Thanks for joining us in this continuing experiment in scholarly communication where we speak to academics and activists about their work and how it helps us to understand a contemporary event or emerging trend and intervene in making the world a better place. Our guest today, Nolan Higdan, is exemplary of this goal. Higdan is the author of almost a dozen books and also serves as a political analyst and a lecturer at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His work focuses on the intersections of politics, media, technology, and education. A prominent voice in media criticism, he's a columnist for the Gaslight Gazette on Substack, host of the Disinfo Detox podcast, and a frequent media commentator appearing weekly on Just Ask the Press and the Fox 2 Morning Show, which is, I assume, different than Fox, but maybe not.
Yeah.
In addition to his role as a national judge for the Project Censored, Higdon is a regular source of expertise for major outlets such as CBS, NBC, Fox, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He's joining us today to speak about his latest book, MAGAcademy: How Corporatism Paved the Way for the Hostile Takeover of Higher Ed. So thanks so much for joining us, Nolan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
There's a lot to dig into here, but the main point of your book is that the MAGA assault on higher education over the last year and a half or so was predicated on what you call an institution hollowed out by decades of neoliberalism. What does this concept of neoliberalism mean in the context of higher education?
Yeah, neoliberalism was a kind of third way ideology that emerged in the United States in the 1970s. At that time, there was a lot of public resentment for government. Remind you, this is after Watergate, the lies and failures of Vietnam, the inability of the Carter administration to seemingly solve things like the gas crisis. And what the United States people saw as international embarrassments, such as Iran taking U.S. hostages and the Soviets seemed on the move in Afghanistan. And so all that coupled together, oh, I can't forget my most favorite. The church committee hearings were also going on,
Yes.
which were exposing a lot of government corruption and lies. And so really conservatives really seized upon that to say, this is why we've always been skeptical of government. Now, you have to remember that prior to that, Americans had a pretty positive view of government through the New Deal and the Great Society. And this idea that people were turning against government was a pretty big ideological shift. But conservatives had been ready for this for quite some time. You can go back and look at folks like James Buchanan, who was working at the University of Virginia. You can look at the Powell memo. And they talked about how basically, we need to organize conservative interests, corporations together, feed cynicism about public institutions, and run things at the behest of the market versus private industry. And so they were sort of ready for that. And the Reagan Revolution really ushered it in. But it began with the Carter administration. Carter started to believe that the problems with the economy he couldn't solve were due in part to big government. And you started to see him relax things like regulations, most famously on the airline industry, which
Sure.
we all know sucks now. And so, but Reagan, really normalized it. He was the great kind of communicator. So be it. And then every president subsequently, Clinton normalized it in the Democratic Party. Obama gave it a friendly face in the Democratic Party. But neoliberalism was basically predicated on this idea that government is the problem. So we need to lower taxes, get rid of regulation to make a more friendly environment for industry. We need to be able to have public institutions run more efficiently and have accountability like they would in the private sector. So bring in like corporate managers to run public institutions. And they believed that the future lie in a global trade economy. This global trade economy really was a way to undermine labor unions and undermine democracy because you can outsource, if you're a corporation, you can outsource your manufacturing base. But if you're a union member, you can't take your union rights with you to other countries. And
Sure.
so this free trade, or as they called globalization, they thought the way the US would be competitive was with technological innovation. And so without regulation, taxation, technological innovation is the future. So whatever's good for tech is good for the country. So how does this fit in with higher ed? Well, a lot of higher education institutions were public institutions paid for by tax dollars, in most cases tuition free or near tuition free across the country. And they started running them like private institutions. And what private institutions do is try and quote unquote save money by making them more efficient. So this meant um, turning students into customers where they would pay more in tuition. State governments would give less money to public institutions. So those public institutions would have to find wealth from tuition or investments. So a lot of higher ed is invested in like real estate or the market. Um, and the people managing those institutions, we more focused on the bottom line than the quality of education. So how can we become economically sustainable? How can we maintain profits? How can we maintain a robust portfolio? One of the problems they faced, though, is faculty. Faculty
Yes.
unions were very strong. They had shared governance. About 68 to 75% of faculty were so-called tenure track, meaning that they had rehire rights, they had strong pay, strong benefits, they were part of shared governance, they had academic freedom. So when the way to get rid of those folks was to slowly replace them with what used to be about 25 to 30% of the faculty, which were adjunct, lecturer. I collectively call them non-tenure part-time faculty. And you replace tenure track people with them because they have basically no job security, almost no benefits. They cost less. And so they're easy to fire, they're easy to manage, and it's more difficult to organize them against the administration. And so that allowed the executive level, who are concerned with funding, to hire managers to oversee a student base that was largely customers and a faculty base that was largely extended gig workers, and that's where we are today.
It doesn't sound like a very happy place to work. But and I was there on the I was one of these tenure track faculty that was replaced by increasingly replaced by non-tenured part-time faculty. But one of the features of the book is that you incorporate a lot of your own life experience as a student and as one of these non-tenured part-time faculty, contingent adjunct labor. And the chapter where you focus on that is especially powerful, I think, especially for folks who aren't in the industry, because it shows the struggle that's faced by many of those non-tenure part-time faculty. So I wonder if for those who aren't familiar with what this means in concrete everyday terms, what does a typical day or semester look like for a contingent faculty member like yourself in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I want to point out that everything I've said thus far about neoliberalism, that's the way the university ended up before Trump took power, and it's
That's
because of
key.
those weaknesses Trump was able to seize upon. We can talk about this later, but seize upon those weaknesses to transform higher ed into more of the image he wanted. But your question about the average day, yeah. So I told my own personal narrative. I've also done a handful of studies on contingent faculty, and so I use some of the firsthand interviews with contingent faculty in that chapter. And essentially, what it looks like for these folks is you have to be able to string together a living across multiple campuses. And what that means is you rarely get like 100% of a load on a particular campus. But even if you do, it's generally not enough to pay the bill. So we call these, that's why I don't like any of these terms, adjunct, lecturer, non-tenure, or part-time. I kind of fudge them all together because what's called part-time are usually like double timers or triple timers. They're working much more than tenure track faculty in terms of their load. So they're have to figure
And by
out.
load, you mean how many classes, how many students that they're actually encountering every day or working with every day.
Right. And every system is different. So like some systems you're only allowed to teach as a non-tenure part-timer, you're only allowed to teach like 67% of a full-time load. Others you're allowed to teach a full-time load. So in a particular district. So maybe you teach like two classes in one community college district and then another in another community college district. And then maybe you teach another class in like the university system, but the university system is quarter and the others are semester and they start at different times. So you don't get a spring break. All those kinds of things are how you fudge together a schedule. And also, usually the courses are already scheduled. So even if you get offered a course, it may be at a time you have another course offered. And so that's bad for you, the part-time person, because you can't take the class, but it's also bad for the full-time faculty who usually distribute the schedule because they need to manage all these different adjuncts and try and piece together. So they're asking questions like, hey, do you think you'll be available in the afternoon on Monday, Wednesday? And you're like, well, I don't know. I need to talk to this campus because I might be there, but I might be Tuesday,
Yeah.
Thursday. And so it creates all this extra work, and it's not paid labor for the part-timer or the full-timer. This is the efficiency myth that I talk about throughout the book of this ridiculous bureaucracy. And so what it looks like though in practice when you go to work is folks have different approaches, but typically you try and start your day at the campus the furthest from your house, maybe like an hour commute, hour and a half, teach there, then maybe drive to the next campus, maybe the next campus. Maybe because the classes are one's morning, one's afternoon, and one's evening, you're out of the house for like 12 hours a day, even though you're not teaching for the majority of that part of the day.
Right.
And hopefully in between, you can have time to like grade or prep. But in most cases, these folks don't have offices. So you're doing this maybe like in your car, things like that. You have no place to put your stuff, so you're carrying multiple bags of stuff from class to class. Sometimes you teach one camp at campus A, then you go to campus B, then you go back to A, then you go back to B. So you're driving back and forth. You sometimes you can't put in your schedule times for things like bathroom breaks or finding parking if you teach at a busy time of day. I tell a funny story about how one of the campuses I taught at, I pulled into the parking lot and I saw this other part-timer who I'd never met, but we'd circled a lot together. He took down the employee of the month sign and then he parked in the spot and went and taught. So I learned that trick. So I'd go in and like take it down and then I'd put it back up when I left because the spot wasn't filled.
There's
But
no
it's
employee. There is no employee of the month. So
yeah,
it just
exactly.
um
Um, I told that story to my students, and I had a signer in the class, for a student who needed sign language, and the signer just broke laughing. Thought it was like the funniest thing. But those are kind of the experiences, and so I mentioned to you off air, and I think this is clear in the book. One of the ways that like you sort of cope with the system is through humor. You learn to just laugh at it. I mean, if you took it seriously, you'd cry, but uh, it is still important, not only for the struggle of the faculty, and I think some people say things like, well, why stick with the career? You have to remember by the time you get an advanced degree, you've put in 10, 12 years into this. By the time you realize
sure.
you're into the non-tenure part-time and you're not going to get a full-time job, that's another 3, 5, 10 years you're in. It's really difficult to take the majority of your life back and say, I'm going to switch to this. And there's ageism and all the rest of the things
Sure.
that go with that. But in addition to the plight of faculty, which I think is critical, tuition has gone up every single year. So students are paying more and more for these exhausted, spread thin faculty.
Yeah, I was gonna
Um,
ask that. It's
yeah,
sort of
and I think that's the
the
giant
value
contradiction.
there. I mean, I'm not saying
Yeah.
I wouldn't say anything about the value of a non-tenure part-time faculty person. I know they're putting in a lot of work, but being spread so thin, it's hard to imagine the kind of like uh deep relationship with students that you might get if you were in a tenured position, like, which is to say, not that you couldn't have it as a non-tenure part-time, but that's not what the institution is prioritizing, is those kinds of deep uh kind of personal relationships with students.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. That's always what I bring up. I think, content wise and relatability with students, you can be an effective instructor. I've got the good evals and from faculty and students, so I feel pretty confident in the classroom. But I think to really take care of your students, you need to be there on campus. Sometimes they want you to be like a mentor for a club, or they want you to host an event, whatever it is, and you simply just don't have the time, or you're already on another campus, or you can't live near campus because it's so expensive and you don't earn enough to live near that campus. And I think that's the disconnect that students are really hungry for. They want that access to their faculty, but they increasingly don't get the more that these systems rely on these non-tenure part-time faculty.
And it's if we're talking about the value that they're getting for the increased money, then one would think that would create a bit of animosity among the students, that they aren't having those kind of genuine relationship. I think one of the things you then talk about is how they then view themselves mostly as customers. That this is one of the sort of attributes that comes out of that is that they then imagine, well, if I'm just paying for the grade, then I better get the grade.
Yeah, and I try to, I try to be delicate here because I love my students. I love students. I think it's the secret of why so many of us do it is because it is the greatest job in the world, being in the classroom with students. I mean, that's the secret motivation. So this is not like a complaint about students. In fact, it's more about complaining about the way the system treats students
Hmm.
in this chapter. But yeah, I talk about how you have to remember if you're not a younger person that these folks have been told basically since the cradle that getting a good college degree is the way to advance into the middle class. I talk about how the great neoliberal vision for the future was we're going to get rid of all those manufacturing jobs, which are what created the middle class, and we're all going to be service sector employees. Well, the service sector, it ranges quite widely. And there is real no middle class in the service sector. You're either sort of Starbucks target range working as like an employee there, or you're like a doctor or lawyer or a professor. There's not really a lot of middle ground there in terms of income. And so all the incentives are to get a degree to get one of those professions, but that necessitates taking on a massive amount of student loan debt. That was the solution. We know everybody can't afford college, but we'll give access to student loans. Ironically, that was spearheaded by the greatest
Yeah.
representative of the credit industry, Joe Biden, when he was a senator, and then he, at the end of his
Yeah,
life, seemingly tried
I'd
to vanquish it.
forgotten that. I'd forgotten that he was a part of that, but he basically has made it impossible to discharge student loan through bankruptcy. Um, I was thinking that that actually would have been, he could have just reversed that policy instead of trying to forgive all student debt. That actually would have been a much better and maybe even more popular, uh, uh, or even less kind of third rail kind of thing to do. Just say, well, let's let people who are going bankrupt. You can get rid of student debt that way too. Sorry, I know that's a tangent, but it also isn't a
No,
tangent.
I agree. I mean, even though I'm a big proponent of free college and don't think these people should be paying student loan debt, I think it was a really bad political move to say we're going to cancel student loan debt while so many working people were struggling in the economy. Because it was like, hey, wait a minute, the educated, credentialed people who are always talking down on us, they're going to get like a free ride through college, but we're stuck with this bad. I think it was really bad politics the way Biden did that.
Well, even
Yeah.
if they hadn't said that, it was unlikely that that's what the Republican opponents would say about it, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't never it was a very not very calculated move.
No, but there we could go on for hours about the lack of calculation in the Joe Biden presidency.
Or a miscalculation anyway.
There you go.
But yeah, the role of students, I mean, I think we should definitely kind of come back to that and their place in this and how they fit into the vision that you have for a kind of improved academy. Um, but I do think I want to kind of circle back to the place that faculty play in this. I feel the other side of this struggle. I was just recently let go, as we were talking about before. Um, Before we started, me and 50 other faculty at the college have been fired in the last 2 years, which means about 20 to 25% of the tenured faculty at that institution have been eliminated, largely replaced by part-time faculty or by retooling the curriculum. They basically made it so that you don't have to have a core that has liberal arts and sciences. They're just like, if you teach a history of film, then that counts as history. Um, uh, but I think the more important, or one of the really important points that you make in this section is something akin to what Harry Braverman says Taylorism was really about on the factory floor, right? You say the real goal wasn't just to temporarily survive budget cuts, it was to break faculty's collective power by making adjuncts the majority. This move effectively shattered the profession's unity and weakened its voice. And I've certainly seen this myself with what you call the remaining feckless faculty bending to the administrative will. But can you spell this out a little further? Maybe also include a bit about the true villains here, the administrative PRC, but PMC, sorry, how does making more adjuncts or adjunctification, how does that break the faculty voice and solidarity?
Yeah, so one of the things that neoliberals are obsessed with, one is management. That to have accountability and efficiency, we need more management. So you get this so-called professional managerial class. These are people who come from corporate America or with MBAs, and they're going to come manage the educational institutions. in a more corporate way. When we say a more corporate way, particularly in the neoliberal era, that refers to data-driven decision making, where data or empirical evidence becomes the justification for all these decisions we don't like. But it's a canard because data, first of all, it depends on what data you choose to acknowledge. And
Sure.
two, how you interpret that data. Like I made a joke during COVID over and over again. That like I'm sure the administrators were looking at the closed down campuses and they were like, "Oh, look, we got rid of hate crimes because we had no students or faculty. All we need to do is get rid of students and faculty, and we can cut down on hate crimes." Like it's that kind of like ignorant read of data,
Right.
is what I'm talking about. But the way this affects adjuncts and back to our point about students as customers is they have these mission statements, which are largely just vapid language, but one of them is usually, or one of the things usually included is student success. You'll hear everywhere student success. And then, should you ask people what student success means, you'll see a lot of confusion. But in the data-driven world, what it basically means are the students passing? Are they attaining degrees? And so, when you're evaluated as a faculty member, you're promoting student success if your students are passing and attaining degrees. And this also connects to another thing I critique, which is so-called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because if your students of color aren't passing, you might have a racist classroom. And what that does is it creates what we call perverse incentives, which are basically if you have the inability to have any security in your job, you're barely making ends meet. The last thing you want to do is have an evaluation go bad from your superiors that say you're not promoting student success.
Right.
And so, and in part, our evaluations are also partly based on student reviews. And students, they've been told since the cradle they need a college degree. They're taking on $100,000 in debt. They have visions of being like an engineer or a coder or a doctor, and they waltz into your history class and they're like, I'm not going to take a D, because history is not important. It's not what I want to do. I don't care about this. I don't care about democracy, whatever. If you become the faculty member who's known, who won't break in those instances, like you won't have any principles or any standards you uphold, it becomes a negative review from the students, and then it's used by the faculty or the department chair or the manager, the dean, provost, to get rid of you because they have enough on their plate. There's enough other history professors out there desperate for work who are not going to cause more workload or problems for students. And education scholars call this the disengagement compact, where faculty lower their standards, they pass students along so they keep their job. Students give positive evals for the students who don't, for the teachers who don't give much work or much flack, and the system moves along. Meanwhile, the management celebrates they've promoted student success. You've got generations of people getting degrees who struggle to do things like spell their name, but that's okay. The institution will get a grant. It'll get some award for whatever, celebrating diversity or improving student outcomes, and moving right along. And so it creates this really perverse incentives. And I note that I talk about my personal experience with this. I talk about some statistics, but one of the schools that really showed this was Harvard. Harvard had
Mhm.
dramatic grade inflation, as did Stanford. But Harvard, just after my book came out, they announced they're going to start putting a cap on how many A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's faculty can give out as a way to force standards because they know that this is going on. Some of their own faculty, including Steven Pinker, also in the Epstein files,
Yeah.
mentioned this in his most recent book. So it's an open secret. I'm not the first faculty member to write about this. It's been written about for quite some time, but I sort of put it in the context of this adjunctification and the treating students as customers. And again, I think this was the job of management. They wanted to break faculty and make faculty basically just do what we say. Make the class easy, make it easy for us to evaluate. If anybody who was alive during COVID knows that you had to take these classes on how to teach online, even though some of us have been teaching online for like 10 years. And they organized it all the same. They wanted like a module a week. So every evaluator could go in. You could even put like an AI bot to do the evaluation for you. And that's kind of, I think, the pedagogical Taylorism we were talking about there.
Uh, yeah, that seems like the goal is to make it so that you almost don't need a faculty member, which is something that the state of California is testing. So, um, yeah, you've written elsewhere about, I mean, and this is just to take a slight tangent to some of the other work that you've been doing, because you touch on this in the section on the pandemic. You talk about the technology implemented during COVID, having the sort of knock-on effect in terms of corporations surveilling student populations and kind of training the AI. And I was struck by that argument, and I don't know if you can spell that out a bit more, but that seems like an important feature of this landscape right now too.
Yeah, so ironically, before COVID, I was working on this project called what that would eventually become Surveillance Education, which was a book on these surveillance tools in the classroom. But of course, me and my co-author Alison Butler had to rewrite it um, because of COVID and the creation of so-called AI. But basically, I was a faculty member. This was probably, I don't know, 2017, and I was in a large lecture hall, about 500 students. And I was told before that one of the students had we call accommodations. This basically means they're a differently abled student, and under federal and state law, the institution has to give those differently abled students the support they need to get an equal education. And and we can talk about more about how that's abused. But for all intents and purposes, I don't know the student's condition, none of my business, doesn't matter. And but what the student was given as an accommodation was I had to wear a headset where I would talk into a microphone, and what was being said in the class would be sent out to a third party and transcribed in real time to a computer screen that was in front of this student. I think it was a visual issue. But I took umbrage with this. I was like, well, no, I don't want to record in our classroom. Like I talk about sensitive topics. I have academic freedom too, at least in theory, and it could create a chilling effect if people are listening. But I also encourage students to talk about sensitive issues. And you know, education necessitates taking risks and making mistakes. That's how we learn. And if students know they're being recorded and it's being documented, it can be used against them. So this is back in 2017. I had this issue, fought with the administration, basically found the best strategy is to keep fighting. And by the time you're finally forced to do something, finals week comes around, it doesn't matter. But the during COVID, all of these devices were quickly became a part of the education process with almost no input from faculty. We were told to teach on Zoom. You were told to use another video conferencing service, or you had to use learning management system like Canvas. Other people might have Blackboard, Moodle, those types of things. And everything was now owned or accessible by these tech companies, which own these platforms. And for folks who don't know, students have a right that they fought for in the 1960s and 70s called FERPA, which protects their educational data and privacy. Like in higher ed, for example, I always tell my adult students, I'm like, if your guardian reaches out to me, I can't even admit to them that
Yeah,
you're in my class.
right.
That's breaking your FERPA rights.
Which
It's
parents don't like because they're the one. A lot of times they're paying the bill. And they're like, "Why? I want to know. Tell me
yeah,
this." And they're like, "No, I can't. You're not
I,
allowed.
I
It's protected by law."
federal violation.
Mm,
And so, starting with George W. Bush, but really under Barack Obama, who was, deep in the big tech world, they changed FERPA to say that in an effort to make things more efficient and accessible, we're going to digitize all records. And FERPA basically doesn't apply to companies that sign contracts with the institution.
mm,
And so we're only allowed to use school sanctioned platforms, which collect that data. But really, what was going on there is one, it was moving the classroom out of that protected space where students can take risks. Now things can be recorded, teachers are recorded. That creates a chilling effect, both that undermines academic freedom for faculty and undermines students' ability to take risks and be honest. They're afraid if they know what's going on in a class like mine, which is education technology. I alert them to the fact that they're being recorded and documented. But what we didn't know was coming down the pike was all this data that's being collected is going to be used to train AI. And now there's efforts to use that to train replacements for teachers or replacements for teaching assistants, replacements for tutors, all that kinds of stuff. And so it was a huge transformation. Faculty were really disorganized in being able to push back. I think a lot of like established tenured faculty just retired We saw a great wave of retirement during COVID. You had a lot of adjuncts who were just like finally happy to be able not commuting between campuses and have
Yeah.
like a more restful life to teach, online. And so it really people today talk about how COVID hurt education, but I think they talk about it in a different way. It wasn't just that we were on screens. It was the ways in which we normalized that type of learning and kind of the chilling effect and transformation of the community that really had the negative effect.
And the surveillance, this sort of data
Mhm.
gathering that is now capable, and maybe even feeding into some of these platforms that are replacing teachers. I think you just said that before we spoke, that some of the uh, units in the California state system are teaching using AI to teach language classes. So
Yeah, they're doing some tests with that and these and tutoring services and staff. You know, I'm working on a project on AI right now, and I remind folks that like big tech is like an industry that always overpromises and under delivers.
sure,
Social media wasn't social, smart devices weren't smart, and artificial intelligence isn't intelligent. But the PR is so good that all across industries they're implementing it. But 95% of these AI pilots are failing. Even Microsoft has admitted that these AI pilots are failing, and it's creating massive costs that are way more expensive than humans. Businesses are starting to learn that. And just think about things like they've used it in the medical profession, and like Reuters talked about how it's led to like botched surgeries, things like that. So I think the bottom is eventually gonna fall out, but the disruption is massive in higher ed right now, as you know.
yeah. Um, well, but to return though to the bureaucracy, because I think this is actually one of the things that is running more through the whole book is this sort of critique of bureaucracy, and I think all of us have an anecdote of some bureaucracy imposing some Kafka-esque process that could have been replaced by a sort of straightforward decision. But you give some examples of how this works in higher education. But what are one or two that you think illustrate the problem best with the like how is bureaucracy run amok in higher ed?
Uh, gosh. Well, I think so. One of the ways you really sound like kind of a whiny faculty member until you put it in context is when you talk about all the little things we have to do. But no little thing sucks your time. It's the ginormous list of little things that suck faculty time. So, for example, if you, in the state of California at least, but I'm sure this is ubiquitous, um, you have to take like cyber training, cybersecurity training. You have to take sexual harassment training. There might be like an anti-discrimination training as well. And they've tried to make these more efficient by making these like online trainings, and you can't just like click through them. You have to spend like a certain amount of time, like it might be an hour, hour and a half, actually with the screen going. Well, if you have like three trainings per system and you teach in five systems, you may end up doing like 15 trainings a year that are all, the same three, five times throughout the year. And so you have to spend some time. And by the way, they stop running the screen if you close the window. So you might be in a situation where you're like grading on one window next to the sexual harassment training window on the other for days on end doing this stuff. And you already know the answers to the question, but you have to get through the video because you watched the video and the other one that you already passed to do it
Yes.
again. It's those sorts of waste of time. It's filling out accommodation requests. These are requests where a student who has accommodations, and this is a good example of how bureaucracy intersects with neoliberalism in a painful way. Those differently abled students who need support, you have to fill out their form and accommodate them. And each form you have to sign into and accommodate them. When I started teaching, maybe one to two students needed accommodations a course. Maybe it was like 10 a year or something like that. I mean, now it's like 10 a class. And there's some research on this. It has to do with two things. One, a lot of there's data that show that wealthier students in high school have parents who advocate for these accommodations because it gives them an edge in getting into a good college, and those accommodations follow them into college. In fact, there was a student at Stanford who wrote an article about how like Ivy League schools um, tend to have more accommodations for their students, like three, four times more than the general population in terms of a condition or something like that. And she talked about in the article how it was an open secret that students know this is the way you game the system. You get a better dorm room, you get support you don't need, you get excuses for not having to take tests on the dates you want, you get extensions if you don't want to do things on time. And I brought this up to my students, the article. I was like, well, what do you guys think about this? And there was some like resistance at first. They were like, well, this stigmatizes differently abled students. I said, no, I know that. I know students do need it. They're talking about how students openly admit they don't need it, but get it anyways. And I was amazed at how honest they were. They were like, yeah, that's an open secret here. Their justification was, look, we grew up in a crappy environment. We get nothing free. We don't get universal health care. Might as well get this. But meanwhile, from the faculty perspective, you're filling out these forms and changing your classroom. All of this takes time for students who need it, of course. But there is these students who are just gaming the system, and it's taking more of your time. That coupled with like the trainings, the meetings, the evaluation. So usually when you're starting out, you get evaluated like at least once a year. That's like 5 evaluations you have to go through. Those are evaluation meetings you have to do. All that kind of stuff creates this bureaucracy. And then you go into these meetings with these people from campus who have these like absurd titles. I list a bunch of them in here. It's like, the dean of like hangnail trauma. And they talk about how we're like a big family and they care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But of course, it's not equity of pay. Of course,
Yeah.
it's not diversity of ideology. And they try and argue that they're like some socially just organization and they're altruistic when they're exploiting these faculty, dumbing down education and treating students like customers. I mean, that's kind of the bureaucracy absurdity as I see it.
Yeah, I mean, so I admit, like in that chapter where you talk about social justice, I was a bit ambivalent about the critique about how these social injustice oriented policies and practices were implemented, because in my experience, it was student activists sort of pushing for some of those shifts, especially around racial justice and the inclusive language around gender and sexuality, and that was sort of before Trump was elected the first time. But I agree that trying to implement these changes through bureaucracy was bound to create kickbacks, right? And part of it, and as I was reading it, part of my I was thinking like this is related to community in a lot of ways. It's about trying to force a shift in the culture of a community when there isn't actually any community, right? So I don't know, we're all divided, we're pitted against each other. So that seems like it's part of what's going on. But I don't know about your thoughts there, but
Yeah, no, and I agree that a lot of this social justice rhetoric became beforehand. I talk about in the book how the system of higher ed that neoliberals set up is just your run-of-the-mill laissez-faire capitalism, and so they had to wrap it in like that altruistic language. But this is why I spend so much time on the ideology of the institution because things like diversity statements, in my estimation, are used to weed out people who don't have the neoliberal perspective. So, of course, for good reason, they don't want racists in there. But if you're an anti-racist and you're someone who thinks like, actually, I think the problem with the system is capitalism, or the problem with the system is we don't do reparations, or the problem with the system is we don't give like childcare. I think those people are weeded out for the people who think like we just got to get everyone educated, the great degree, then they'll succeed in the middle class. And those are the type of folks you have on campus who believe you can create the right bureaucracy to defeat racism. I call it this like trickle down social justice, where if we diversify the managerial class with people who have the diversity we can see, people who
yeah,
share their diversity will eventually derive the benefits from it. It's the same idea as trickle down economics. If the rich
sure.
have more money, it'll trickle down to the poor. But I think there's a glaring contradiction in there because anybody who studies systems from like a critical perspective would argue that the system itself is racist. Racism is a system, not a series of acts. So if the system is racist, we believe the system itself is going to naturally decide to de-racist itself by diversifying the top, or we just want to give the illusion of being anti-racist at the top to maintain the status quo.
Well, and whether that's explicit or not as a sort of goal, I think you bring up a lot of points about, whether we're talking about the community around the school, the way that gentrification harms communities around those schools, There's certainly very material effects that these institutions have that aren't being addressed by diversity statements or land acknowledgments or anything like this. So it definitely makes it feel performative, even if there are people in the institution who believe it and students who ask for it and push for it. Um, but I think that the larger, to kind of widen that scope, I think one of the other problems that you point to is that there's this sort of mission creep. The universities exist in this neoliberal environment where colleges have to serve as counseling centers, they have to be law enforcement, they have to provide food, housing, and healthcare, because the neoliberal retreat of the state more broadly makes it so that in order for students to live, the college has to be responsible for providing uh, these resources, and then administrators, create these bloated potentates with little ability to reflect on their practices.
Yeah, and I talk about in the book from that. I mean, look, that's something that's been thrown on the university system, like as you mentioned, from this decision with neoliberal budgets cutting funding. But I point out in the book that regardless of the intention, I think the outcome is a lot of saying we're doing a lot of things that we're not doing well and giving the illusion because we celebrate these successes, air quote, and the successes. We celebrate these successes. It's sort of like telling the public that this works. It almost continues the canard instead of saying like, look, this doesn't work. Universities should not be mental health facilities. Or if they are, you need to fund them accordingly and have the expertise there, which we
Sure.
don't. They're not food pantries. They're not, accurately going to be able to deal with like housing insecurity or food insecurity, those kinds of things. Instead, we just put language that we're dealing with it. We have a center for this. We have a dean for this, but it's not actually addressing the issue. And I think it's that performative aspect that becomes so problematic. And the way it turns us all against each other is students are paying more and more tuition. You've got these professional managerial class folks who are making six-figure salaries, $200,000, $300,000 a year, and yet faculty departments are spread thin. You've got a handful of tenure faculty doing most of the bureaucratic governance that faculty are supposed to do. Adjuncts don't have to. They either decide to do it because they think it's career advancement, so they exploit themselves. And these tenure track faculty are saying like, "Hey, can we get another tenure hire?" And they're like, "No, sorry, we need another dean here for this, or all the
Sure.
money's for that." And it really exacerbates, I think, the relationships in the institution, and as you pointed out, with the community. Baldwin wrote this book about In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, talking about how these institutions actually take a lot of resources from the local community. They create like an alternative community, and they use a lot of their policing systems to keep out the local community. The local community basically is usually people of color who come in to work like service sector jobs at best. And so you don't really have that kind of community building. A lot of the resources the community probably needs or wants are supposedly at the university versus actually accessible to the community as well. So I think that's that kind of community aspect you're talking about. That's one of the things I
Hmm.
emphasize at the end of the book is like it's not just enough to be physically in the community. Like you need to be a part of the community. The community needs to have like events, whatever, farmers, markets or speaking events, blood drives, free dental care, all those kinds of things need to be, I think, part of that for the community versus where
Right.
we just sort of go study the community around us.
Totally. Well, so I guess, I mean, as we're kind of getting close to the end, so I want to make sure you get to say what is then the MAGA Academy. I know that those of us who are in colleges and universities have felt something, felt this shift, or what seems like a shift, um, in the last 18 months. But I mean, I think you make a compelling argument to kind of talk about how all these policies and practices led to it. So what is the MAGA Academy, and how did all these earlier iterations of the institution lead to it?
Yeah, and so I start the book in the waning days of 2024 to remind people that um, the violent crackdown on Gaza protests started under the Biden administration and was in a lot of blue cities. We've got to remember Democrats have pretty much led the way on higher ed for the last handful of decades, the neoliberal party as it is. And those students were responding. One of my classes, we look at advertisements in higher ed, and one thing that becomes, well, two things become clear. One, you rarely see like learning or a classroom in the advertisements.
Sure.
Two,
People on the
two,
quad. People on the
yeah,
quad. Yeah.
a nice pool, cheerleaders, all yeah. Um, but the other thing is that, especially out here in California, but this is true around the country, there's a celebration of like student activism in the brochures. And in my time teaching, I've seen campuses celebrate Black Lives Matter. They celebrated support for Ukraine. But Gaza, Israel was a real pivotal point. I talk about how one of the campuses I taught at, the president's office, wrote letters of support for Black Lives Matter on behalf of the campus, wrote support for Ukraine. But then when it came to Gaza, when faculty were debating Israel's U.S. support for what Israel was doing in Gaza, later classified as a genocide by everyone, but basically the U.S. and Israel, they shut down communication on the email. And students who protest saw their protest shut down. They were called like anti-Semites, even though I was on the ground with protesters. We're literally Jews for peace, and things like that. We can talk about how you can't be an ism to be part of the ism. But anyways, so there was those things going on these
And they and,
campuses.
and they and they literally shut down the like they had said you cannot speak about Gaza on email.
Yeah, that was considered non work related rhetoric. But we had been talking about Black Lives Matter in Ukraine laudingly for years before that. Um, so we had that, and then the shutdown of the encampments, and then a lot of like graduations because I was in the spring. A lot of graduations went online, and then when we came back in the fall, there were all these new rules that basically made it impossible to protest on campus, and that's where I kind of started the book. Is me arguing with the administration about like, look, this doesn't. I don't care where anybody stands on this particular issue. We have to be able to protest. Like this is a First Amendment issue. That's where the book starts. I'm not arguing for Gaza or Israel. I'm not getting into the weeds of that. I'm talking about just protest in general. And I talk about how embarrassing it is as a faculty member in the 21st century having to explain to a public institution why we need the right of the First
Protest,
Amendment.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. So that's the environment, though, that Donald Trump walked into. And the argument I make is that a lot of the tools that were put in place by neoliberals he used to his advantage. So a lot of the tech in the classroom and surveillance he's used, in particular, to target initially what he called anti-Semites, but really was anybody who was challenging kind of the conservative or U.S. status quo. He later on expanded that to target what he called anti-American, which included critics of capitalism, critics of Christianity, etc. He also continued steamrolling encampments. He used basically the same kind of DEI logic that was used to go after faculty, saying they're like bias or racist. He would use those same mechanisms to go after faculty, supposedly for being anti-Semitic, for being critical of Israel. But I think most importantly is the funding model that now these institutions were so dependent on their different funding, particularly like research funding. Trump did what he could to hold that over their head in exchange for concessions. And this was like inside knowledge on faculty and students. He wanted data on them. Trump used also wanted to change curriculum. So basically, he held the federal money over their head if they weren't going to get rid of like DEI, which in the book I critique corporate DEI, but he's not getting rid of like corporate DEI. Trump's saying basically anything that talks about gender or race or class or sexuality, he wanted rid of. So if it's a Black
Yeah.
Studies course, he wanted rid of that. That's not DEI. That's a field of study
Yeah.
that he gets rid of under the DEI umbrella. And so Trump was very successful in doing that. He also closed the DO, well, or will soon close the DOE. The DOE is not so much involved in higher ed, but it does play a critical role there. And he was able to do this, again, quite rapidly because the institution is run by people who believe in process over purpose, the managers who believe in the system. They worked with the Trump administration. Faculty, I think tried their best, but again, they're not only weakened, they're also very divided. A lot of these faculty, again, were like adjuncts and things like that. And the institution, there was a division within faculty, and I went to a ton of these meetings, which is, well, the institution really sucks. It sucked for decades. Do we really want to fight Trump and defend this institution as
Really?
it is? And there were some people who said yes, and some people said no. And there was a lot of those kind of discussions, but that was kind of the environment Trump walked into. Those are the tools he
Right.
used. So this MAGAcademy, as I describe it, which is very focused on, you know, sort of patriotism, narrow white male hierarchy, love of capitalism, integration of Christianity, further entrenching the market, further entrenching this kind of authoritarian power. All those tools were in place. Trump just used them. And that's why I end the book with suggestions to say, like, Trump leaving office is not going to be enough to solve this problem. You can't go back to 2015. You're going to have to think more broadly about transforming the institution.
Yeah, I definitely think the Gaza protests were, as you say, a nail in the coffin for both academic freedom and the perception of the university, and also Democratic Party. Doesn't seem to be a lot of reflection about that, but I agree. Well, so as we're closing, what are some of the other recommendations you have? You have a chapter on kind of undoing the MAGA Academy. What are some of the other recommendations you make for doing this?
So some of my probably less popular ones, until you get an explanation. I think a lot of these, like we were talking about the bureaucracy, a lot of the services universities do need to be broken off from the university. Things like mental health, food security, housing security. Those are policies that need to exist. They need to be funded. I'm not saying get rid of those like they're not important, but I don't think they should be under the purview of the university. I think standards, maybe something like Harvard is doing right now, is critically important, and encourage faculty to uphold those standards in a lot of ways.
You mean
I don't know.
like grading?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
and I don't know if I necessarily like the quota system that Harvard has, but it's I think better than the current system. I think we need to deepen tenure. Faculty need to be in a stronger position. This is an academic freedom issue. One of the things that I think, and I talk about this in the book, a lot of people get wrong. They think like the faculty lounge is full of like Marxist language. It's the most like pedantic corporate nonsense in those faculty lounges. We really need faculty who are more aggressive in challenging the status quo. I think that's good for the public in a lot of ways. And so I think we need to increase and strengthen faculty. That's going to cost um, more money going to faculty, less going to this professional managerial class. If we're going to make cuts, it shouldn't be to faculty. It should be to those performative actors there. And I think our students need tuition-free education. This is just a absurdity to put them under debt. It's also an absurdity, and this is the other controversial one, to force everyone into college. I think everyone should have access to college. Everyone should have a seat in college, but not everyone should feel compelled to go to college. There are other valuable things to do in life, and we should pay those fields accordingly in the capitalist framework. If we're going to keep the capitalist system, we may let it die for neo-fascism. But if we keep the capitalist system, I think paying those and making a college more for people who do want to learn and extend past like high school, maybe get it into these kind of professional jobs. But those who don't go should get equal pay and respect for those types of jobs as well, because I think they're forced into an environment that they may not want to go. I think that's uncomfortable for them, but I also think it's negative for the learning environment when you have students who just admit, I don't want to be here. I'm here because my parents made me, or I'm here because
sure.
I have no other choice. The other choice is working at Starbucks or whatever. And I think those are kind of things that need to change.
And tax the rich. I think that's the other
Oh yeah.
feature that's sort of underlying all of this is tax the rich, provide the services, give free education, and then also maybe give free vocational training if the students are more interested in that. But that seems to be the big uh, the big thing that needs to happen for all the other things to work on a certain level.
Yeah, and I think like I mean in this country right now, it's very clear that the billionaire class has taken over politics, certainly this administration. And whenever we threaten to tax them, they're like, "I'm going to leave California. We're going to leave New York." Like, good, leave. Go take over the government of China. Like, get out of here. Go.
Yeah, yeah. But, we'll take a little bit of your money on the way out,
Yeah.
but I think there's a lot to chew on here, and I recommend folks pick it up. It's a short read, but it's dense. So thanks for joining us to chat about it.
Thanks, Sean. It's a pleasure, man. Congrats on the podcast. It's awesome.
Thanks. And this episode will be available on the YouTube channel later. It's recorded, so please share it with your colleagues. Let us know if you have any future ideas for episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining us. Again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com. And Nolan, remind me, it's the Gaslight Gazette is the one that you mostly write at. Is that
Yeah, nolanhigdan.substack.com. And you can also check out the Disinfo Detox podcast. We're on all the major platforms.
great? Well, thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care.